thing that Queen's Chronicle does, and Ree, another very shy retiring woman. So congratulations to everybody on the panel, and thank you for having me.
Importance of women in the history in film, right?
If you were asking me a question, I didn't hear any of it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Little issue with right there. How about now? Can you guys hear me okay now?
And we can see you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Kath, I was just saying thank you for being with us once again. We appreciate you coming back and repping that cause of the Queens World Film Festival, obviously an important part of the community. And, you know, from the perspective of women's history, we can't underestimate the contribution of women in film, right? I mean, can't have films without women, obviously.
Well, you know, the most prolific two filmmakers ever in the history of the industry were two women in Queens at the very beginning of the 1900s, Alice Blaché and Lois Weber. Alice Blaché was in Flushing. And of course, they both eventually went to Los Angeles, but they were the most powerful, dynamic filmmakers at the beginning of the industry.
That's super. I'm glad I asked you that question. And that's why, because I didn't know that. And probably some of the viewers didn't know that either. So that's, I'm glad you mentioned that. All right. And Ree, is Pam with us on the Zoom? Okay, we're gonna go to Barbara. Barbara from Jam Fam is going to be talking to us about her scholarship program and other things. Thank you for being with us, Barbara.
Okay, I would like to thank God for allowing me and all of you for being here today, because so many of us didn't make it for various reasons. I would also like to thank Ree of the Chronicle and all the event sponsors and everyone that's involved in getting this event started. I would also like to honor our first responders and caregivers who dedicated their time and their service, fighting and saving lives during these unprecedented times. In honor of Women's History Month and senior living, it is my sincere pleasure to be able to talk about the accomplishments of women and how seniors can share their living experience with the next generation. We are grandmothers, mothers, sisters, wives, aunties, caregivers, first responders, hidden figures, and even vice president, all standing on the relentless shoulders of ancestral women around the world who shattered glass ceilings and refused to take no for an answer, just for being a woman, the backbone of society and more. We stand on the shoulders of ancestors that came before us. We all come from different backgrounds and have seen many things in this walk called life. Whether the talk was on a smooth surface or one with expected dips and cracks, we knew there was a destiny that was waiting for us at the end of that walk, a destiny that would take us to new beginnings and a sense of accomplishments for ourselves and for our families. For women, oftentimes the road was paved with the word no, written in bold letters telling us what we should not do and could not do because we were women. Our voices restricted, undervalued, or heard, but not enough to have a final say. In the 1930s, my grandmother made the decision to migrate, I should say my grandfather, he made the decision to migrate his family from the Jim Crow laws of South Carolina to the suburbs of Queens, New York. However, as the family voice of reason, a well-respected opinion, my grandmother did not have a say in the matter. Although they would be escaping the horrors of the Jim Crow South, this was still their home. My grandmother would be leaving behind her parents, siblings, and other relatives. She was a homemaker, a housewife, the backbone of the family, while my grandfather took care of his family financially. This was the makeup of most families in those days, and as the man of the house, his word was final. Pops was not having it. I'm sure my grandmother had no appreciation for Jim Crow, and her main concern was to keep the family together. But my grandfather's word was still final. There was a destiny in the North for him and his family. And my grandmother would call it home, not realizing that the destiny that awaited her. She multitasked family chores just as she had done in the South. And because a mentor, and became a mentor for her children and prepared her daughters for generational change. Women like my grandmother still didn't have the right to vote because of the color of their skin. Women of yesterday and today have always been advocates for change. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells, Rosa Parks, and countless others. But the framework of the women's suffrage movement was passed in 1919, and the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. Even though a woman of color supported the march and marched behind the movement leaders, they were left out of the 19th Amendment and did not have the right to vote until 4 decades later. 4 decades later. My grandmother continued to raise her children and became involved in the Christian church. She sang on the choir and together with my grandfather, formed the family gospel quartet. Her relentless involvement in the church not only gave her a voice, but strengthened her character, which would be apparent after my grandfather died 16 years later. Her life changed, and now she was not only the backbone of the family, but its financial caregiver, an added responsibility that she was not prepared for. However, because of her Christian beliefs and newly found voice that had been some 16 years in the making, she found a road called perseverance and succeeded in her journey. My grandmother's story is just one of many in the world of great women, past and present. No journey is too small in how it impacts others. Think about contributions in even one person's life as a mentor, a caregiver, an educator, an inspirer. The history and contributions of women are great. We've flown around the world, became entrepreneurs, started movements, refused to take no for an answer, and were the catalyst for change in our communities and the world. Women continue to fight for equal pay while multitasking between careers and taking care of their families. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as first responders, women had to multitask between taking care of very sick patients and going home to take care of their families. Some had even expressed that they stayed in hotels, not going home at all, or sending their children to stay with other relatives out of fear of bringing the virus home. In homes where both parents were frontline workers, this concern was magnified, stressful, and unbearable. There was even a call for retirees too. Some who had been enjoying the next chapter in their lives as seniors, who joined the call to save lives. As a retiree who has proudly embraced the next chapter, the next journey on the walk of life, I have seen many changes right here in my beloved Queens, where my grandparents had called home. I love Queens and dare anyone to speak ill of it. I worked here, made a life with my family, and retired here. I've seen single family homes demolished and construction giving birth to multi-family dwellings. More cars with brighter lights and loud music, with car-shattering bass being played from them. But I have also seen diversity and people who love Queens just as much as I do. Like my grandmother, mentoring and giving back to my community and teaching my children how to be the best they can be is a fulfilled feeling when you can look back on your life and theirs and see that the journey has been worth every dip and crack in the road. But with so many changes in the world as a retired senior, I know that there is still much work to be done and much for me to learn along the way. Modern technology is no longer the future, something out of a sci-fi movie or Jetsons. It is the here and now, and it is us who are being mentored and trained by younger generation to be the best we can be in this new age of technology. I admit that this particular part of the walk has not been easy with Facebook, Instagram, Siri, and Apple CarPlay. These things are not going away and have been introduced into my home and yours by your children, grandchildren, some of us doubling as grandparents and teachers due to remote learning and having to recall math equations and what to do when the Wi-Fi goes down. The pandemic changing all our lives. We've been inspired from our families, or maybe even learn a new dance on YouTube. The pandemic giving our lives as seniors a test of our endurance. After 30 years of public service, my husband and I had retired in 2005. I had no clue as to what I was destined to do, but I made a decision to get involved with my church, community, and politics. The Christian values that I had learned from my grandmother and my mother taught me to have faith in God and believe in myself. I was not the homemaker, housewife that my mother and grandmother were. Through their experiences, they inspired me to find my own voice. I was married to a wonderful man and I became a widow in 2014. I thought we'd spend our retirement together, never thinking that I would be alone. I did not expect the walk of life to take me on this journey. I was alone and scared and had forgotten my voice, but I found strength and trust in God and remembered that even as a senior, there was still a destiny for me. I didn't have the worries of my grandmother having to be both homemaker and breadwinner. My children were older, working, and had created lives of their own. I didn't have to be strong all the times. My children were there for me and encouraged me to get up and do something that made me happy and to do things that empowered my spirit, traits that would go a very long way when the COVID-19 pandemic changed our lives. In closing, I would just like to say, women are most powerful today than ever before. We still multitask and do a variety of things, and some women have great partners who share family responsibilities, while women share financial responsibilities. Change has not been easy, but I have embraced senior living through encouraging others to mentor young people and allow ourselves to be mentored. Mentoring can be in the form of teaching young men and women a craft learned or teaching our grandchildren about our family's history. And while we may not agree with them, we can listen to their ideas and thoughts on life. Let's embrace them and wish them well. I am the founder of Babs of Jam Fam Entertainment, and we promote community events. Most of the events are sponsored for a mature adult audience. If you like old school music, jazz, Latin, clubs such as Birdland and the Blue Note, Babs of Jam Fam Entertainment is for you. But what's most important to me is that some of the proceeds from these events are allocated for music scholarships once a year to help young people. This is the walk that I have chosen, but we can all do something. We just need to know what that something is. I love senior living, and I am grateful to be given this opportunity. You can learn more about the Music Scholarship Program by logging on to www.babsofjamfamentertainment.com. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Stay safe, and I hope that we can all come together in the near future. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I mean, that was amazing. That was beautiful. That was a well thought out and detailed description. I really liked how, I mean, your personal history and your family's history that's amazing to hear about, but I thought it also nicely framed the women, the whole idea of women's suffrage and women coming up through the decades. And thank you for sharing that with us. Our next presenter, we're gonna hear from Kelsey Brow from the King Manor Museum. Kelsey.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So as Women's History Month winds down, I thought it might be nice to take a look not only at women who made history, but women who preserved history. So I'm Kelsey Brow, Executive Director of King Manor Museum, a historic house in Jamaica, Queens, that uses Founding Father Rufus King's anti-slavery legacy to teach critical thinking to thousands of visitors and school children every year. Our current exhibit marks our 120th anniversary as a museum open to the public, and it's all about the history of women and historic preservation and the impact that this legacy has on this pink collar field today. So I'm wearing a pink blazer in that honor. King Manor is the longest operating, or one of the longest operating, historic house museums in New York City, and one of the earlier historic houses to be turned into a museum in the United States. My background is our dining room, which you can actually rent for meetings. It's set up like that right now because the women who preserved this space actually used this room for meetings in the early 1900s. And it's kind of fun to think that we can use the space the same way today. If you haven't been to King Manor before, you may have at least driven past it if you've ever had to go to one of the courthouses in Jamaica or just seen it from the window of the Long Island Railroad. But if you haven't heard of King Manor before, I'm sure you've heard of one of our sister sites, George Washington's Mount Vernon, and perhaps even visited there down in Virginia. Although most of these historic houses were home to famous men, and here's a little picture of Rufus King. Let's see. I'm green screening, so it's a little bit hard to see him, but he's kind of looks really like any of the other founding fathers. But unlike George Washington, he's a little bit less well known. So George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, was preserved by an organization called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who inspired a lot of other women to follow in their footsteps and preserve the homes of famous people from early America. So again, although it was mostly about men's houses, it was women who were in charge of doing this work. Women at this time were not really supposed to be working outside of the home, especially the sort of moneyed class of women who were more philanthropically minded and had the leisure time to do these sorts of projects. They really felt that this idea that the 19th century had of men and women being in separate spheres and women being identified with the home made the preserving domestic spaces of the founding fathers socially appropriate thing for women to do at the time. Just a little bit of background about King Manor. It was purchased in 1805 by its founding father, Rufus King, whose wife you see in the photo or the painting behind me. And together, he and his wife were they were a couple who were ministers to the court of St. James in England. He had fought in the Revolutionary War, and most importantly, I don't know if you can see my little pin, it's a logo of the Constitution, because he was a framer and signer of the Constitution who worked very hard to keep slavery out of new territories with the hope that it would die out eventually. And his son and grandson went on to do the same work in their father's footsteps to stop the spread of slavery and hopefully get rid of the institution within their lifetimes. The last person who lived in King Manor was Rufus King's granddaughter, Cornelia King, and she passed away in 1896. Now, Long Island and Queens at this time in 1896 looked a lot different than it looked in 1805 when Rufus King bought the house and made this room that you see behind me. For example, the Long Island Railroad that I mentioned before, the tracks actually run on land that used to be part of the King family's 150-acre working farm. So by the end of Cornelia King, that granddaughter's lifetime, a lot of the property had been sold off, leaving about the 11 acres that you see as King Park today. And people really weren't sure what to do with the house. A group of women formed what was called the King Manor Association of Long Island, which I still have to say one on our bank account, so that's the very long name of King Manor Museum. And they worked to preserve this house. They wanted to preserve something of the bucolic nature of the neighborhood, or what was known as the village of Jamaica then at this time. In those of you who are New York City history buffs might be remembering that just 2 years later, in 1898, Queens became one of the boroughs of New York City. So not only was New York City getting larger in terms of population, a lot of new immigrants were coming and making it the diverse place we know and love today, but the concept of New York City was also growing. It wasn't just Manhattan, it was now the 5 boroughs that we've got today. So this house was preserved to keep some of that local history for future generations, especially because it was home to a founding father. They thought that was really important to highlight. And not everybody always agreed with them, though. For a long time, people were, the King Manor Association of Long Island Women had to work very hard to save this house. The house is today owned by the New York City Parks Department, just like the land around it. And at certain points in its early history, the Parks Department thought that they should just tear down the house and have more open space in the park. It is a very old wooden structure and difficult to maintain, which is why after Cornelia King passed away, none of the other King family members wished to live in it at the time, and it became part of the park. The museum opened to the public in 1900, and even several decades after it was opened, people were still debating what to do. There were articles in the newspaper about turning it into a branch of the public library. So these women had to work very hard to preserve this historic site, like we do today. Although King Manor is owned, like I said, the building is owned by the Parks Department, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. Those are not honors that come with financial support. So just like the women did back in the day, we have to work very hard to fundraise, to preserve and share this wonderful history with everyone. Something that I think is really exciting is that despite all of these challenges, the women were able to integrate King Manor as a museum into the fabric of the cultural tapestry of New York City. You can see in this 1939 guide that King Manor had already become part of New York City's must-see attractions. This is a 1939 guide to the World's Fair. A little bit about the women in this organization, something that I think is really interesting is that these women, although they all came from pretty similar upper class affluent backgrounds, did not have the same idea about what women's role was in society at this time. So not only was New York City changing, but the world was changing for women, as our wonderful previous speaker has done a very, very wonderful and touching job of describing. So some of these women, they're kind of well known at their time. Maybe some of you have heard of Alice Morris Earle. She wrote a lot of books about colonial collecting and kind of was an instigator into, or just a major player anyway, into this craze for collecting colonial antiques at the time. And several of her personal viewpoints were really at odds with many of the other women in this group, because she did not believe that women should have the right to vote. But some of you may recall a few years ago, when you go and vote and you get your little "I voted" sticker, there was one option that was an old black and white photograph of a woman yelling into a megaphone. And that was Rosalie Jones, who was actually one of the daughters of the founders of the King Manor Association that saved this museum. So I think it's a real testament to the power of women that, although they disagreed on these very important issues, they were able to work collaboratively to save this house. And I hope that some of you will be able to come visit and see our exhibit that tells you about all of these topics and much more in more detail than I have to explain to you today, and also with a lot of really interesting objects that you can see up close with really cool details, including a painting that has hair painted into it, and a shaving kit owned by somebody who worked with the Marquis de Lafayette of Hamilton musical fame. This exhibit closes on April 30th. That's the last weekend in April, Saturday. So I hope you're able to come by. We're following all of the COVID compliant measures that are necessary for our sector, so you'll be very safe. We really look forward to welcoming some of you. And if you can't make it, we are having on March 30th a more in-depth presentation on the history of women in preservation and how that impacts the field today. So thank you very much for tuning in to me today, and I hope that I'll see some of you at the Manor in the future. A big thanks to Rebrin at the Queen's Chronicle for inviting me to speak to you today. She also coordinates these great pop-up small business fairs outside of the museum. So there's always a reason to come to King Manor. We also have many family activities that you can check out either in person or online, and changing exhibits. If you're not able to make it in time before this exhibit closes, we're actually working with an organization called the South Queens Women's March to host an exhibit on contemporary art made by women in our borough. So I think that'll be very interesting for you to see. And also, if you've noticed, the woman, Mrs. King, Rufus King's wife, Mary, in the background is wearing this beautiful white dress. Well, thanks to funding from the Greater Hudson Heritage Network and the Robert David Lang Gardner Foundation in Long Island, we were able to conserve her white dress. And we are now working on a mannequin that will imitate the 1805 dress form that she would have had, her own figure, so that you can see the dress, how it should have looked. So that's something that, it's just an absolutely stunning and beautiful dress, a material, tangible aspect of women's history that I hope you'll also be able to see. So again, thank you very much for listening, and I wish all of you a wonderful rest of Women's History Month and good cheer and good health.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Thank you for being with us. That was an amazing presentation. I love your museum. I hope to do a field trip there in the near future. Maybe we could even do an event there one day if you have if your space is set up for that and you're able to do that. So thank you for being with us today. That was you're incredibly photogenic and well spoken. So I thought it was an amazing presentation and a great representation of not only your business, but businesses in New York City. And I'm a history buff, so I loved hearing all those historic facts that you threw in there. And thank God the museum is there and thriving and doing well, and that you have the funding to keep it going. And hopefully we can be a part of that, keeping that going in the future. So thank you so much, Kelsey.